I'm your host, 123 Jackie B, and stay tuned for an interview with Scott Turner Schofield.
Welcome to Popcorn Talk, featuring movie discussion, news, and interviews. Popcorn Talk. We talk movies.
Welcome to the Popcorn Talk.
Hello, everyone. I am Jackie B, and I am here with Scott Turner Schofield, who so graciously decided to join us. He's most known for his role as Nick on The Bold and the Beautiful, and he's been interviewed here before by my good friend James Lott Jr., but today he's being interviewed in relation to all of his theater work, and he's done 3 one-man shows. That's correct, 3, right?
3, yep.
Which is amazing. I mean, I can't even believe the amount of work that must have gone into that. So, our site can be found at Broadway Be Down on Twitter. And you want to give them your Twitter handle?
Sure. I am Turner Schofield. That's Schofield. At Turner Schofield across all of the media, all of the social thingies.
And I'm retweeting it right now.
Thanks.
There we go. So how did you first become interested in theater? It seems like from reading your bio, it seems like you've done theater for since you were young. So
yeah, I was the kid who sort of blocked the television to perform for my parents, much to their chagrin. But I started doing theater seriously in high school. And that was a really powerful moment for me because, I was one of those sort of at-risk youth in that way of that, I was at the time, we'll just say LGBT. I've been all of those things. I've been lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender all at the same time. So, I was an LGBT youth and, I didn't know the words. I didn't have, but I had this knowledge of myself that I needed to be who I was and be seen and be loud and proud. And before I had any vocabulary for that, that's what theater was.
I do see theater as a vehicle for that because I've done theater since I was young, and I slowly watched my friends come out and change their gender expression throughout their lives, and I felt the same way about them as they didn't have that language until they were able to kind of put it into words, I guess.
Well, yeah, and have whatever it is that theater gives you, that courage, that confidence that doing theater as a young person gives you to speak truth and stand firm and do that. That's actually sort of an acting trick, right?
It's true. I mean, one of the most beautiful things to me about theater is that when I studied theater, and this is something you touch on in both your TED Talk and in your one-man shows, where gender to a certain degree is performative. We go out there and we're taught, okay, you behave this way if you're a girl, you behave this way if you're a guy. And it's interesting to me because theater people, they inherently in themselves don't necessarily believe that they have to behave one way or another, but then when they go out and perform, you're taught, okay, well, if this character has this gender expression, you have to behave this way or sit this way. I can remember I did the Laramie Project in college, and we actually got this chart that was okay, if your character's more masculine, you sit closer to this end of the chart, and then if your character's more feminine, you sit closer to this end of the chart. And it was so wild to me because I'm here I am studying a chart where I'm okay, heavier steps is more masculine, and
right.
It's so fascinating because these things have been ingrained in us as young people, and I think that's what's really great to me about theater is it kind of teaches you that blue and pink weren't always associated with boys and girls. These are just made up things that our culture has assigned to us.
Exactly. When I wrote my first show, which is called Underground Transit, I wrote it in college, and it was in this kind of moment where a couple different things were happening. I was majoring in theater, and I was getting straight A's. Teachers were saying to me, you're really good. You could actually do this for a career, teachers don't say that. Any good acting teacher, right, is going to say, if you can do anything else, do that, because being an actor
this is hard.
The worst.
Yeah.
Right? They're trying to save you from something. But so my teacher was saying, great, but then I wasn't getting cast. And we had a professional, I went to Emory University in Atlanta, and we had a professional company that was in residence at the college. And so they did all these shows, and I wasn't getting cast in anything. And finally, a mentor sat me down and said, okay, here's the deal. You don't look like a girl and you don't look like a boy. so we can't cast you as a girl or a boy, and there aren't any roles for that. But, you know, you don't have to sit around and wait for somebody to write a role for you. You could just write your own. So that's happening in one corner. I'm also a women's studies minor, right? And I'm starting to learn about the performance of gender, the way that we talk about it in queer theory, right? And talking about, you know, even feminism. We go back to Beauvoir. A woman is not born, she is made, right? And understanding that society constructs how we do exactly what you said, how we do masculinity or femininity, right? So I've got that happening. And suddenly I finally get the word. I finally meet somebody who is transgender like I am. I was aware that there were transgender women, but I wasn't aware that there were transgender men, because men tend to sort of blend in and become invisible. And nobody talks about it anyway, right?
Totally agree with that.
Right?
I totally agree with that.
So there I was. I finally met somebody who was trans, and all these things coalesced in this one moment. And so I wrote a theater show about it, a one-person show, so that I could star in it, because I hadn't gotten any leading roles in my college. And to their credit, Emory Theater Studies program produced my show.
That's amazing.
It was amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, it wasn't too much. It's a one-man show, so what are you going to do?
Right.
And in that one-man show, what I did was I had written a bunch of kind of spoken word poetry. Spoken word was like really hitting in that time. And I had written probably 6 long-form spoken word poems about my experience of gender and my understanding that I was transgender, and also my reticence, because like I said, I was a feminist. I am a feminist, and I was a women's studies minor. And I was like, do I become a man? Like, do I want to be a white man? Like, this is really hard to deal with right now, right? So also my reticence to transition at the time. And so it was kind of this thing about gender fluidity. And what I did was I had this script of kind of spoken word poetry broken up by rock music.
That's cool.
And during those rock music breaks, I would change costumes. And as you watch this progression from a very feminine girl to me in a suit. And then finally, the last kind of the coda of the piece is me in this ridiculous outfit that I found, and I was like, that has to go on my show. Right? It was like board shorts and matching visor in this kind of bright mustard yellow. You know that car that's like really bright, like that color yellow, you know? And you know, and it's funny because you watch me go through this, and people said they were like, you really became the gender of whatever character you were playing, and then at the very end, you were just yourself. You know, and that was exactly the point of making that show.
So you did this show, and then you did 2 others. What kind of led you into doing 2 other shows?
Well, so what happened was Emory produced Underground Transit, and it got produced a couple more times around Atlanta, where I was living, in the following year. And at some point, after, like, somebody saw that production that Emory did, and they were a college student at another college in upstate New York, or no, it was Bennington College in Vermont. And so she called me and said, hey, on your spring break, do you want to come perform at my college? And I said, sure. And then she told some friends at Bard College, and they said, yeah, have him come while he's here. And a couple other colleges. So before I graduated from college, I had a tour.
That's so
put
cool.
together. And also kind of on the side, my college internship was at Damon Records, which is the Indigo Girls, Amy Ray has this record company. And I was interning for them, and I learned how to put together a tour. So I just kind of kept doing it, and I learned how to do it, and I got some, you know, Bitch Magazine wrote me up, you know, feminist magazine, right?
That's like, so cool.
Wrote up my show, and then a lot of other people started calling. It was mostly colleges at the time, but then some theaters started calling, and I started doing like workshops for college kids. Like I taught at Yale School of Drama, like when I was 27, you know what I mean? Like, just, you know, like a workshop, but that's a big deal.
But that is
a
big deal.
Like,
yeah, that's a really big deal.
And just, you know, and I like guest lectured for Kristen Linklater's class, you know, like
you're like surreal. This is so surreal.
I think that was at Vassar. And so it was just like it was just something that very organically happened. And I did that for a few years with Underground Transit, and I also had this other story that I needed to tell. And I'm from the South. I've grown up in a lot of places, but mostly in the South. And when I went to high school, I went to a private school in Charlotte, North Carolina, and most of the girls were debutantes. And so I hung out with a lot of debutantes. And I kind of learned that culture, and I had these 3 experiences that really happened in my real life. I was going to these debutante balls, which the girls call coming out. I'm making my coming out. It's so fun. You can't make that up, right?
Right.
So I was going to these coming out parties, and just happened to be coming out myself in different ways. The first time I was coming out as a lesbian because I didn't know that I could be trans. I didn't know that that was a thing. Then I came out as a radical feminist when I was in college, and then by the third time I was a trans man. I was identifying as transgender, and there were just these stories that happened with each thing that you can't make up, that need to be told. And I found myself, I was sort of at bars with people, they'd be my go-to little bit stories that I would tell people, and they would laugh and say, you got to tell that story. You got to tell that story. So I did what Peggy Shaw told me to do. Peggy Shaw, amazing one-person show person. Still, she's in her early 70s, I think, still doing one-person shows, amazing, seminal solo show person, performance artist. She said, when I'm going to do a new show, I just book a venue, and that's my deadline.
That's awesome.
So I applied to the Chicago Single File Festival, which sadly no longer exists, but it was a great festival for solo performers. And I said, I'm going to do this show for you. And they accepted it, and I did it. And it was like the hardest thing in the world, but I pulled it off. And people loved it. It's a pure comedy. People think that transgender work has to be sad or hard or something. And there's enough drama in it to, there's a little bit about my parents accepting me, and a little bit about my girlfriend never being accepted anywhere, and some other things like that. But overall, it's a very funny piece, and it just got sucked up, and people wanted to do it. And then I had those things under my belt, and I gate crashed the National Performance Network is something that any theater artist in the sound of my voice should look up. The National Performance Network. They're amazing. They're a network of 60 to 70 theater venues around the country. They do work that's political. They do work that is identity-based. If you're African American, Asian, LGBT, all of the different identities, they're super supportive of all these works. And they have a thing called a Creation Fund grant. I knew an NPN theater. I knew, and that theater, one of the people at that theater said, "You got to come to this conference, their annual meeting." And I was like, okay. So I just booked a hotel room and went. And I got there, and the woman was like, "This is invitation only." And I was like, "Oh, but I'm here." And and she had seen Underground Transit. She had seen me at a thing called Alternate Routes, which is another political theater organization. And she said, "You know what, but I saw your work, so why don't you just go ahead and go in."
That's cool.
Totally the gatekeepers of the world letting, it's that's great. And I got stuck in an elevator with an arts presenter. And so we were stuck in the elevator when we were chatting, and her name is Pat Graney. And finally she was like, "Who are you and what do you do?" And so I gave her my little elevator speech, literally. Right? And she said, "Are you coming to the LGBT caucus?" And I said, yeah, which was all of the LGBT presenters in the network. She's like, "Let's go. As soon as we get out of here, let's go." Okay. So we get there, and she goes in, and she's leading the LGBT caucus.
Wow.
And she says, "Scott has some really interesting things to say. Scott, I think you need to tell people about transgender representation in theater." And at the time, we're talking 2005, there wasn't much
there really wasn't.
At all.
There really wasn't.
So that's what I told them. And I got a bunch of people who were interested in my work, and I got 3 theaters that were interested in commissioning it, and it became the first transgender theater piece to be commissioned by the National Performance Network.
That's amazing.
And it just kind of kept going from there.
Right. What's interesting is in your... You can find these clips of them on YouTube. I just want to direct our viewers to that. And then in your piece, Debutante Balls, you compare gender to class in such a way that like you said before, that it's funny. It's like anybody if there's a discomfort with the subject matter, you've blown it away for them by making them feel comfortable, by allowing them to laugh.
Exactly.
And I think that's what really good theater does, is like when you come in and you're like, oh, I'm not sure, and then you're like, okay, now I'm all on board with this, because we've crossed that barrier. We've said this is like the elephant in the room, and I'm showing it to you. So you say, when you can't tell somebody's gender identity, just like you can't tell their class status, it's never polite to ask,
Right.
which to me was the funniest thing.
So true, though, right?
Yeah,
so
it's
true.
so true. It's so true. So tell me about your writing process. Like, you did say that a lot of this came from natural conversations that you had at bars, but was it hard to translate that into a theater production?
Well, that show sort of fell together pretty well, but that kind of kernel about the class thing is a really good point, because I premiered that show in 2004, and it took me until 2006 to get that class piece. That whole, like, it's like 10 minutes of the show, right? Where I'm like talking about, you know, being middle class and how that's like just like being transgender, because everybody's so panicked about being middle class all the time, right? What happened was, I was doing the show, and I would get to this place where eventually that little moment went, the class moment went, and I would go up on my lines. It's like I knew there was something I needed to say there that I wasn't saying. Mm-hmm. And I would totally like lose my train of thought, because my brain would go off and be like, no, you got to think about this. Well, maybe this goes here, you know. And finally, I just I had my aha moment and said, like, oh, I've talked about gender, I've talked about race, I need to talk about class. Duh, like that's and class in the debutante world, right? Because, you know, my family, at the time that I was going to the debutante balls, we had money. We didn't have money until that point, and we didn't have money after that point. But, you know, I could still go back into that world, and nobody would ask me, like, how much money does your daddy make? You know what I mean? Like, nobody ever asks you that, right? So
it's a different form of passing. It's like,
it is.
You know, we have people in the LGBTQ community who are passing in certain respects, and then you have people in class relationships and also in race relationships who try to pass. And it's so fascinating, because to me, it's like you have all these people trying to pass, and it's like, you said, actually, you did this BuzzFeed thing that I saw as well about masculinity, mm-hmm. and you basically say, just be you, right. You know, just be you, which I think is the best advice in the end.
It is. And what I found out is that people will project whatever they want to project on you.
Right.
So it doesn't matter if you're struggling. I mean, the thing about passing, right, and trying to pass is that it means that there's failure on the other side of it.
Right.
If you don't pass, then you fail. Mm. So, you know, if I go out into the world and people perceive me as a guy, if I pass as a guy, right, like, cool, that makes my life easier, because then that means I'm a white guy, right? And then if I dress up real nice, then I pass as somebody who has money, mm-hmm. you know, and in LA, everybody thinks everybody has money, right? Right?
So like, true.
Right? We don't know, right? Like, you could be my next producer, you know? And people, you notice that people treat you, you notice in the way that people treat you, all the ways that you pass or don't pass. Mm-hmm. If people treat you poorly, it's because you're not passing in some way.
Right.
Yeah, it's really interesting. But back to your question about, you know, my process. Yeah, I had these sort of 3 stories, big stories to tell that all hooked onto the same kind of spine of the debutante ball narrative. And then I just kind of found, I knew I wanted to talk about sexuality, gender, and race at the time. And then I found the class piece, right? So it was like, I need to talk about these things. So I kind of stitched in kind of transitions and ways of, I tried to think, like, how can I make these things interesting? How can I make it like political but not didactic, right? So the way that I talk about race is everybody, when they come into the theater, gets a small Dixie cup, right? Dixie, hello, right? Right? You get a little tiny Dixie cup, right? And everybody's like, what's this for? Because it looks like a cup that you pee in at the doctor's office, you know? And so they get this little cup. And then I come out on stage, and I've got a big pitcher of sweet tea. And because sweet tea, the South, right? So I'm walking around and I'm talking to them about sweet tea and the importance of sweet. Like literally in Georgia, restaurants can be fined for not serving sweet tea. It's like a law.
I just, what's so funny is this is just a sidebar, but one of my cousins from Georgia just visited me recently, and we went to have lunch in Beverly Hills, and they were like, "Are they going to have sweet tea here?" I was like,
Nope.
I don't think they know what that is. I was like, they're just going to assume that you're going to put sugar in some tea. I mean,
yeah, which is not the way. That is not sweet tea. Yeah, exactly. And I talk about all of that, right? And then I say, listen, so sweet tea is kind of the and when you ask for sweet tea in restaurants, when you ask for iced tea in Georgia, you get sweet tea. You have to say, I want unsweet tea, and then they put like a spoon and a lemon in it to make sure everybody knows that you're not having sweet tea, right? And so I said, like, sweet tea is like served without question, just like my whiteness. Right. And so I figured I can't change anything about my whiteness. It's the backdrop of my story, and there's nothing I can do about it. But I wanted to like serve it to you sweet. Right. And that's my like white privilege, like owning it and saying, like, let's all be aware of this. And now we have to go into the rest of the story. Right. Are you with me?
I love that. Well, what kind of advice would you have to our listeners if we have somebody in the audience who maybe wants to do their own production? What sort of advice would you have for them?
Well, if you want to do it, that means you have a story to tell. And everybody has a story to tell. I don't believe for a second that anybody hearing me doesn't have a story to tell. So what you have to do is find that story. Right. And actually, I'm a real proponent of the idea that every person's story can actually change the world. And why I say that is because you could think of yourself, you could perceive yourself as the most boring person in the world, right? And you could write a show about that. And 10 people in that audience would be like, I thought I was the most boring person in the world, and I was going to kill myself because I thought I was so boring. Literally, I mean, I'm not exaggerating. Like, that's the power of story. And unfortunately, now we have these sort of sound bites, and we talk to each other online. We don't tell each other our stories. But when you do, you change things in people. You open people's hearts, you access their empathy. And if we were doing that, we wouldn't have the issues we have today, honestly.
One of the most, just bridging off of that, one of the most fascinating things to me about theater, and why I think theater is the perfect medium for you to choose to do these one-man shows, because they're so personal. Right. There's nothing... The first time, there's nothing quite like live theater, which is cheesy and, whatever, but it's true. The first time I saw Hedwig, I was in a small theater that was a dinner theater in Baltimore.
Wow.
And I was in a table seat, like right in front of Hedwig. And I'm like, this is the way to see Hedwig. I almost don't want to see, it's coming to the Pantasias, and I'm like, I almost don't want to see it there. It's so impersonal. And I've seen it from a cafe position, which if you think of it, it is kind of like a cabaret show anyway. So to me, there's something very unique in that person can look you in the eye, right, and pass a message to you that you're not going to get from another medium.
That's exactly what it is. And when you watch someone, for instance, with Underground Transit, I would transition in front of people's eyes over and over and over again, and they would go on that journey of transition with me. So there was not a single person who could leave that space saying that they didn't intimately understand a transgender person's story and struggles and issues. Now, I'm only one transgender person, but a lot of that is really similar.
Right.
And I know that changed things, it's just when we are behind a screen of any sort, we have the choice of whether or not we have the distance, right?
Yeah.
When we're in the room with somebody, you're like atoms are mixing up. I mean, think about it on like a quantum physics level, right? Like we're not actually separate in this room right now.
Yeah.
Our atoms are all mixed up.
We're the only people in this room right now. It's crazy.
I know, right? But we're all mixed up in each other,
right?
And so that's working on you on a level. Like, we're working on each other on a level right now, and so that's why I'm such a proponent of theater, even if it's very hard to do. But the one-person show, just economically, right? The one-person show medium is a way that artists can take control of your acting life. You don't have to get cast in it. It's your own show, right? You can learn some of the business of theater and learn how to approach venues and get produced or produce yourself, which is the way to then know how to approach venues and get produced because you know how to be professional, right? And you can go on tour with those things. There's like so many things you can do. You can perform, I mean, depending on the setup of your show, I have performed in a living room. And I have performed at the Carnival Center in Miami, with all the bells and whistles, right? So you can really do anything with a one-person show. And I think every actor really needs to go through the process of creating and performing one because it gets you so deeply in touch with all of your own emotions, how you act, right? And once you know how you act, then you can act anything.
That's true. I had a theater professor who said he was casting Richard III, and this guy came in, and he kind of walked with a limp on one side, and then he straightened up, and then made himself a hunchback on the other side, and he's like, I was just like flabbergasted, right? Because you're thinking you don't know your body enough to know you already are walking with a limp on this one side of your body. Why wouldn't you just use that?
Right. We get in our minds too much. Yeah, it's a good, doing one-man shows is a great way to use actors. We're too mental all the time, right, in so many ways, but but we overthink so much, and so it's a great place to put all of your overthinking because a lot of us, we're either we can be good writers and we can be good speakers. We're usually at least one of the two, if not both, right? And so it's a really great place to put all that brain chatter and all of that control freakness, right, into creating what is essentially a theatrical poetry. Like a one-person show is a theatrical poem, if you think about it, right? And so you can just take all of that and put it in there and then act it. I just don't think that there's much of a better way to do it,
I mean, I love that description. And also you did a French festival as well. Now, do you speak French?
Un peu.
Did you have to speak French for this show?
I did.
Oh, you did?
I did. So what happened was, the longer story of it is I got a Princess Grace Foundation fellowship, and it gave me a salary for a year to work at a theater in Atlanta called Seven Stages, but they didn't have anything for me to do, so they were like, right. So they had a bunch of international companies coming in that season, and they asked me to be the liaison. So I would pick them up from the airport and take them everywhere and show them around and all the things, right? And I got this French company came in. This director, Eric Vignier, and his folks came in, and they put on a show, and I spoke pretty good French. And he was just but I was the only person who spoke French. So he was so happy, to have someone to talk to. And he didn't speak any, really much English, And so we got to know each other. He invited my show to the National Theatre of France in Lorient. And the show was a runaway success. People, my dressing room was rushed by teenagers. I was like a rock star. It was so strange.
Crazy.
It was great.
Wonderful.
It was totally great. I was full nudity naked on the 11 o'clock news. I was like, what? It's France. They don't care. Right? And so 5 years later, after that, he invited me to come perform in a play that he was putting on. And he was like, oh, but you will have to come for a year. We are going to, blah, blah. So I went, but I had turned 30, and the brain really changes, and it really does. I thought that was a joke. When I was in France 5 years earlier, my French took off. It just advanced. I was almost fluent. I was so good, it was crazy. And then I got there, and I couldn't put two words together. It was the hardest thing. And so I ended up learning my script phonetically. I had people record what it's supposed to sound like, and without even really knowing what it meant, what I was saying, I just sort of learned it that way. And then over the time it took between when we started rehearsing in Avignon, which was the festival, and then the rest of our tour for the rest of that year, I started to understand what it meant. But I felt like such a fraud. Talk about imposter syndrome.
No, but that's, I mean, Andre the Giant, that's how he learned his script phonetically.
Really?
Yeah. He had to, the same way you're experiencing, which is the reverse since he's French, or he was French. But yeah, that's how he learned his Princess Bride script. He listened to it phonetically.
Yeah. It was wild. It was just this really so I did my one-man show in French. It was wild. And then when I got there again, I couldn't do it again in French. It was so strange.
Hey, I mean, I could see where that's hard.
Don't wait to learn a language. Learn it now.
It's so true. It's so true. It's so much easier when you're younger. So we have a current election coming up. And I would be remiss if I didn't talk about this, because I think, we're talking about political theater.
Absolutely.
And we're talking about when you're in the room with someone, it's hard to escape that person's personhood. Like if you're standing in a room with someone, I've had friends who, I had a friend that I worked with who, another friend that we worked with, he's gay and the other person is straight. And they went, this friend went to photograph his gay volleyball league. And he was like, I was so adamantly anti-gay until I went to this volleyball thing and took all these photos and realized, like, these are real people. It sounds so silly.
Yeah.
It sounds so silly, but it's like, at the same time, when you're in this room, when you're in the room with someone, when you're interacting with someone, you start to understand how they think and how they feel, and that they have feelings just like you do. And it's so fascinating to me because in this election, there seems to be like this hardwired forgetting that, like, we have people in this country who we're alienating. And I guess the first thing I want to speak about is the South Carolina bathroom law, which you touched on in your interview with James. But I think one of not only is it a transphobic law, but it's a sexist law. Like, you're not saying that your main concern is women in the restroom. Your main concern is not the men's restroom. And so that's always, like, bugged me too, because I'm like, I don't go into the bathroom afraid. Like, why are you making this assumption that women are going into the bathroom like,
it's
oh my
patriarchal.
gosh.
It's saying, like, we need to protect our women. But honestly, like, it's not even about that. Like, that law had buried underneath it a provision to stop cities in North Carolina from having to adopt the $10 an hour federal minimum wage. Like, the whole thing has just been a total ruse for a Republican agenda, that has everything to do with making life hard for the middle class and poor people, and nothing to do, and they just took the ick factor. They're like, we'll just throw the word transgender at it, since that's like real big right now, and and people will go, ew, ick, and we'll get the vote. And that's exactly what they did, right? So yeah, you're right, it's sexist, it's patriarchal, it's transphobic, and it's like, that's just the beginning of that, right?
It just it fascinates me too, because at my other job, we have a lock on the women's bathroom door and not a lock on the men's bathroom door. And when they first installed the lock, I was like, well, where's the one for the guys' room? And they're like, oh, well, they don't need one. I was like, oh, they don't. Right. Okay,
men don't get assaulted ever.
Right. And then
men's rape isn't real.
The other thing that really bothered me was, I was like, the door to this restroom is like 2 inches from reception and like 5 feet from finance. So you're basically telling me everybody I work with, if they hear me scream, they're just going to turn the other way, which I have like a strong belief in my coworkers to believe that they're actually not that mean. So I was like, I just don't get it. You really think that no one would like come help out even if they saw someone they didn't know in the building, because they have to pass by reception to get to this place?
The fact about this bathroom thing, people say, well, all these people, there's been a surge of people who are men going into women's restrooms now. Those people, yes, that is happening. Those people are not sexual predators, and those people are not transgender. Can I say the A word here?
Yeah.
Those people are assholes.
Yes.
They are assholes who are trying to prove some kind of point.
Yeah.
But that's what's happening. Now, in 17 school districts where they have gender identity bathrooms, so like you can go to the bathroom of your gender identity and not of your birth sex, right? Yeah. Meaning, like, I can go to the men's room even though I was born female, right? 0. Exactly 0. Like, couldn't draw a harder 0, right? that's how many cases that they have had any trouble with. Like, they haven't had any assaults, like nothing's ever happened. And PolitiFact, which is a really conservative, but bipartisan, but still very conservative news fact organization, found that there have been no cases of men using the transgender excuse as a cover for assaulting women. And let us not forget, men assaulting women in women's bathrooms has always, since the beginning of time, in every state forever, been illegal.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So, and it's the phrase that we like to put on it is it's a solution without a problem.
Yeah.
You know, and it's simply there to divide people. It's there to make transgender people the butt of the joke again, and it's utilizing sort of the basest instincts of our population. Now, that said, it's a bunch of white male Christian crybabies having their last temper tantrum, and I'm not worried.
Well, it's like, I feel like at this point, you know, we had the first transgender speaker at the DNC recently. They're holding on to that last vestige of, okay, well, we have this thing that we can still like be angry about.
Exactly.
Because it's like, if you had Donald Trump in his speech mention the shooting in Orlando, and you know, everybody was supportive, and you're like, well, you have to be supportive, because at this point you look like a friggin' idiot if you're not, you know, and we just want it that way across the board. It's like, you look dumb at this point if you're not on board with like rationality.
Well, they would just look, you can't take the biggest gun massacre in American history and not have sympathy for that. And the thing is, like, talk about alienating people, you know, what's very hard for me, and I work very hard at this, I sacrifice a lot, I work very hard, is to remember that, like, okay, these are real people, and they're coming from a background, like, they've been taught this way. You have to be carefully taught, right? They've been taught this way, and they're human beings just like I am. And look, in that moment, they access their empathy. So they have empathy, right? Okay, this is something I can work with, right? This is something that we can educate people, and people don't get educated by being didactic, by being like, I get mad and I say things, which is my right. But when I'm in the room educating people, I let them be exactly where they are. I say, okay, but have you considered the fact that 17 school districts have had zero problems? That PolitiFact on Fox News said this, right? Did you know that? Oh, I didn't think you did. But now that you know that, can we both agree that perhaps this is a solution without a problem?
Right.
You know, and having that kind of calm dialogue, right, is, you know, and plus telling your story, right, is something that can really kind of help people do this. Now, we think about the movable middle, right, because that's who we're really going for in this election cycle. You've got the Bernie bros on one side, right, all the entitlement, none of the knowledge. And you've got, as much as the Trump followers, it's bonkers, but like sort of about different things, right? You're not going to be able to talk to them. They're not going to listen to you anyway. They're too busy mansplaining and white-splaining, right? So you go to the middle, right? And here you have everybody else who's like, I don't know what to do. This is all crazy, and Facebook isn't fun anymore. And, you know,
Facebook is not fun anymore.
How do I deal with this, right? These are the folks whom stories really approach. So anyone within the sound of my voice, if you're LGBTQ, if you're Muslim, if you're any of the things that the Voldemort campaign is aggressing upon, go on Facebook and write a very short, not too long, don't read, right? But like a pretty short story about something that has happened to you with your identity. This could be your first one-man show. It's on social media, right? Your first one-person show on social media.
I love this idea.
Tell a story about something that happened. What I did, I told a story about how before I knew I was transgender, but I was very masculine, a lady who looked like my mom, like 50s white lady, beat me up in a bathroom. First, she thought I was a boy, so she started hitting me with her purse. Then, when I pulled up my shirt to show her my bra to prove to her that I was a girl, she started screaming "dyke" at me and continued hitting me with her purse.
Jeez.
And I was in the movie theater with my parents. I went in there, I was bleeding. I went back into the thing. My mom said, "What happened to you?" And I told her I walked into a door because I was so ashamed that who I was and how I presented in the world had that happen to me, that I acted like an abused person, right? I mean, I was an abused person, but I acted like it, right? Because I didn't even want to give my mom like the opportunity to say, well, sweetheart, if you would just dress a little more feminine, right? So I wrote that on Facebook. You only had to hit the more button once to read it, right? It got, I can't tell you how many likes it got. It's still getting likes. I got interviewed, like the Daily Beast called me about it. Like, I've been getting press things about it because it's a story about the problem and about what happens when you make rules like that, right?
And it's personal. You made it personal. And I will say that if you do a story like that and you would like me to retweet it, I will. I'm at 123 Jackie B. And I'm more than happy to retweet anyone's
I'll retweet
story.
it too, at Turner Schofield. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Make it your first one-man show.
Your first one-man show on social media. I like that. One-person show on social media.
I like that. Good job.
Hey, all right.
Quick thinking. I guess.
But don't read the comments.
Trust me. Like, any person in any sort of public capacity, you have been shat on at some point. I've been shat on. I'm sure you've been shat on. It's just like, do you like how I use the phrase
it's kind
shat
of a game,
on?
It's
Yeah.
like run between the shit drops.
Right. And sometimes it surprises you because, like, sometimes you're attacked by people you were like, whoa, did not see that coming. That was like out of left field shit on.
Yeah.
And it's
the friendly fire is the hardest.
Yeah, it is the hardest. And you just have to like ignore it and bounce back because it happens to all of us.
Right.
It happens to all of us.
You do.
I have to move it to like a lighter note before we close up. If you could play like any role in theater, what role would you play? Like a dream role.
My goodness. A dream role. I have like 6 different things going through my mind right now.
That's okay. You can list like all of them if you want.
Okay, I'll list all of them. Hedwig, Puck, anybody in a Sam Shepard play that I could play. Anybody. I'd play basically any character in Doubt. I'd play... I know like in an hour I'm going to be like, that one! What am I doing? Right? Romeo, God... too old, but I would.
No, I saw an RSC production with a Romeo was definitely older than you by 10 years, so it's possible.
But I think honestly, if I could play any role, I would play a role that I can't even imagine yet, but a role that utilizes everything about my skill set, so that I love everything that I'm doing when I walk out on there and I feel really good about it, that doesn't have anything to do with being transgender or even being like a person. You know what I mean? Like that doesn't have anything to do with my personal story. At this point, I would love to just act in any role that allows me to do what I've only ever wanted to do in the first place, which is act. I did all this one-person show stuff, which was amazing because I've gotten to tour the world and I've gotten all these awards, and I've been really successful with the one-person show thing, but I only did it because no one would cast me because I was trans.
Yes.
So I think the world has moved. I know the world has moved away from that. And I'm really looking forward to the moment when somebody says, hey, man, why don't you come play this role? And, that role is really fun.
I think there today, as opposed to like you were talking about 10 years ago when you started this journey, I do think today that people are thinking outside the box as far as casting. And it's interesting to me because theater, I'm like, you're theater. You're supposed to think outside the box.
Right, but theater's made by people.
That's true.
Right? And if you think about what people knew back when I started about transgender stuff, right? Like, I think of everything they don't know now, and what they didn't know 10 years ago was astounding. So it gives me great faith in humanity. It is a little difficult to be ahead of the curve all the time.
Yeah.
You kind of just want to be in the flow,
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Scott.
Thank you for having me.
Where can the people find you? On Twitter?
You can find me on all the things, all the medias.
All the medias.
Scott Turner Schofield. Check it out.
You can find me on all platforms, 123 Jackie B, except for Snapchat is Jackie B123. Thank you so much for listening to us here on Broadway Breakdown. And next week, we're discussing Les Mis the movie.
My dad loved that.
From producers Maria Menounos, Kevin Undergaro, Phil Svitek, and the entire Popcorn Talk Network, we would like to thank you for tuning in. For questions or comments, be sure to visit popcorntalk.com. I'm Sir Richard Wentworth, and this has been a presentation of the Popcorn Talk Network.
The views expressed herein are those of the hosts only and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Popcorn Talk Network or its owners or principals.